There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
Hello YouTube, welcome to Known Unknowns, a new video series that I will be doing on Mondays, digging into the controversies of Star Citizen and giving you my take on them. The title of the series comes from the Known Unknowns quote from Donald Rumsfeld, which you heard during the introduction. I probably won't replay it every time, but it did stir up a lot of controversy over intelligence and was mocked by the press, and therefore I find to be very fitting for this series of videos. Today we're going to be digging into the 300's performance in Arena Commander and the much wailing and gnashing of teeth by 325A owners in the forums and on Reddit. And I think a lot of it is just being very, very short-sighted, because what makes a great ship in an arena combat situation is not necessarily going to make a great ship come Persistent Universe. Now, granted, we're probably at least a year, more likely 2 years away from seeing the Persistent Universe in any meaningful shape or form. But I think it's important that people who maybe pledged for the 300 series ship, let's say last year, kind of keep some perspective here on where things are going. Now, it is true that a year ago, the 300I was touted as a bounty hunting ship, the 325A a more hardened combat ship that may be capable of going to a Hornet or up against a Hornet in certain situations. In very many respects, it was the F-16 of the Star Citizen universe, whereas the Hornet was the F-15 space superiority fighter. The F-16 being a multi-role combat ship. Likewise, the 300 series was a multi-role combat-oriented ship, compared to the dedicated combat role that was the Hornet. Some of the advantages that were touted would be the 300 would see probably a faster overall speed, much better fuel range, better fuel economy, much capable of, taking on higher endurance missions. So maybe the Hornet, which was dubbed a carrier short-range fighter, would only be able to jump 1 or 2 jumps without having to refuel, whereas maybe the 300 series could go 5 or 6. Now, these are all kind of known unknowns at this point. We don't know exactly how fuel mechanics and things like that will work in the Persistent Universe. But just from the general ship descriptions, the 300 series was aimed at being that longer-range escort fighter. Also, it would be capable of holding a limited amount of cargo, allowing you to do some trading on a small scale, where the Hornet would be able to carry next to nothing, and if you did carry and store all box, you would be very limited. You'd have to take off one of the gun turrets, for instance, in order to do so. So, this is the reason why people bought the ships. Well, now we are a year later into Arena Commander, and the 325 a couple of weeks ago was introduced into the engine. We've had the 300i trainer for a while, and we've had the 350R trainer for about almost 2 months at this point. And as a result, people are flying them and finding that they're not stacking up as well against the dedicated space superiority fighter in a small combat arena. And part of me is going, well, duh, that's kind of what one should expect at this point, but there are a number of other factors that are really kind of crippling the 300's performance. One of them being the size of that combat arena is very, very small, especially with the bump up in speed from version 0.8 to 0.9 of all of the ships. As a result, the chief advantage that the 300 series has over the Hornet, that being speed, and the ability to then pick and choose when the 300 series engages in combat, isn't really applicable at this stage. Now, couple that with the fact that many of the ships are still buggy. Many of the ship's subsystems aren't even integrated into the engine yet. Even things like on the Hornet, half of its weapon mounts aren't hooked up to the power system currently. So you're limited to using ballistic or basically kinetic kill weapons in those slots. You can't even use laser weapons effectively there, as of yet. Likewise, the flight models are still undergoing further iterations of, the engines are kind of turned up to 11 right now, or the maneuvering thrusters are. I expect those to get dialed back eventually, and when we do, we're going to see, I think, a marked difference in how these ships fly. I think you're going to see your linear thrust provided by your main engines being more of a factor over the number of degrees per second that you can pull in roll, pitch, and yaw type maneuvers, as well as the strafing type maneuvers. So there's further refinements to the flight model that's going to happen. We know this. This is a known. The other factor that I think is primarily crippling the 300 at this point is the lack of a quality targeting or aiming mechanics. And we know that this is going to be further iterated upon, and hopefully 9.3 we'll start to see the introduction of those things. Other mechanics that aren't even in game, emissions. Those heat-seeking missiles you've gotten with the trainers that kind of lock on to anything at any aspect, may turn to, you got to lock on to their main engines in order to get that enough of a heat signature in order to fire. Whereas the Talon IR Stalker missiles, we'll be able to aim at any time. I also expect that all the weapons are going to receive a major balance pass, and when that happens, I would expect the Talon IR to gain a little bit of a range advantage over, say, the Marksman HS, because the Stalker IR is kind of an AMRAAM or maybe a Sparrow type missile. I would really say more like the Sparrow missile. I know people are going to harp on me that, no, it's not an active versus a semi-active versus... Just hear me out. Sparrow being a medium-range missile that requires a lock. I think that the friend and foe missiles are more like the modern AMRAAM, more fire and forget. But the Bearing kind of heat-seeking missiles are an equivalent of the Sidewinder, which are shorter-range missiles designed as a dogfighting missile, essentially. And none of those mechanics have been balanced out yet. I expect there to be at least some sort of auto-aim or auto-convergence, whatever you want to call it, on the Class 1 weapons, that if you get your nose within that lead indicator, a targeting computer will take over the rest. I also suspect that you'll be able to slave, well, we know that you're going to be able to slave Class 2 weapons to a targeting computer and have it essentially auto-aim those weapons for you. There might be advantages, slight disadvantages, but I expect to see the weapons behave a lot more closer to Elite Dangerous in those respects in the future. Maybe not to quite the degree that Elite Dangerous has in terms of automatically gimbaled weapons, and even slight gimbling on fixed weapons, but certainly closer to those aiming dynamics. They're going to have to, because that will really balance out the controller input types between mouse and keyboard users, HOTAS users, and gamepad users. Once you get those type of mechanics in there, I think we're going to be able to see that the 300 series is a much more capable fighter than it currently is in its current state in version 0.9.2. Now, something else I have loaded up here in the ship stats page is the Gladius, because another area that people are going to take kind of points with me are going to be, well, the Gladius is now the F-16 to the Hornet's F-14 or F-15. And no. The Gladius, I think, is more, in terms of semi-modern Cold War era, maybe fighter, the F-5 Tiger. And I base this on a couple of things. Now, the mission roles have changed. I mean, again, the 300i was originally marketed as a bounty hunting ship, and it's now stated as being touring, kind of more of a luxurious ship. 325A was always marketed as the more combat-hardened variant, which you could turn a 300i into 325A simply by purchasing the weapons and the targeting system. So there wasn't much difference other than you just started with a little bit better weapons and targeting system, targeting computer. Size, they're similarly sized, the Gladius being a little bit narrower at its height and a little bit shorter, same width. Again, multi-role. You're going to be able to haul some cargo, probably in an external pod of some kind. They're still looking into this, but at least with these two variants, 350R is a little bit more dedicated. One-person crews, power plant, size 4, but you'll notice also the 350R has a size 4 power plant. I suspect that this has to do with being a 2-engine versus a single-engine fighter, and double engines require more power. I'm going to assume that's kind of how it works. That's kind of a known unknown at this point, I guess you could say. Now, the engine sizes are listed as a TR2 and, TR4s over here, including 2 on this model. However, its mass is roughly a little less than half of what the 300s are right now. So that means that the Gladius is probably lesser armored than the 300 series. At least that would be what I would assume, but I guess there are other things that could take up more mass as well, just structural components, things of that nature. So I think that's kind of interesting. We don't really know anything about shield mechanics at this point to really make a fair comparison, other than the max shield size is going to be 3, and they're 3 across the board. So same size shields. But really what makes the Gladius an F5 versus an F16 is that it carries, as of right now, all size 1 weapons, compared to the 300i is carrying size 3, size 2, and size 3. So the 300 series, while weighing more, is also carrying more firepower, much the similar way that an F16 can haul more bombs than an F5 can, or more missiles than an F5 can. That still doesn't necessarily mean that the F5 doesn't have its role. It's even more maneuverable, arguably, than the F16, and has been used as a OPFOR, or opposing force fighter, in red flag exercises for a couple of decades. It even made an appearance as the MiG-28 in the movie Top Gun. There's no such thing as a MiG-28, by the way, in case you didn't know that. But again, we do know that the 300 series, I know that things have been balanced and things will be further balanced, but the Sledge and the Almansky 6 lasers, man, they hit like a tank. And that's, I think, the point of the 300 series. You're going to have to adapt more boom and zoom type tactics with it. And it's going to be one of those things that if you can outmaneuver and get in close on the Hornet, you're only going to need a couple of shots to really severely hurt that Hornet. And if you think that Hornet pilot's going to be better than you are, you have the speed to just run away. And that's going to be a factor in the persistent universe. Doesn't matter how good of a pilot you are in a Hornet. Once that person in the 300 series can just simply run away, can hightail it out of there, there's nothing you can do as a Hornet driver. You know, those are just kind of simple facts of how the game is performing right now. So that's kind of my view on the controversies with the 325, with the 300 series in general, and Arena Commander. We're just not to a state where we can fairly judge these things yet, people. Now, if things perform like they do now, and it was Arena Commander version 1.0, and the maps had been extended, and passes on the targeting mechanics had been made, and aiming was a lot better, flight was a lot better, you know, then I would say maybe there's some rooms for some valid criticism and complaints. But as it stands right now, they know the 325A isn't quite there yet. Hell, they know the entire game isn't even quite there yet. You know, all these subsystems, emissions gameplay, aiming mechanics, targeting computers, none of that is in Arena Commander. So if you're thinking about melting your 325A to get a Hornet or 300i, my recommendation would be wait. The reason being is, what is this awesome ship in Arena Commander may turn out to be quite the dud for what you want to do in the persistent universe. So, take a wait-and-see approach, guys. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for next week. I'm not sure what our topic will be, but I'm sure there'll be some controversy come up to address. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share, if you haven't already, to the channel. And see you next week.